Ecology of the Garden of the Gods, part of the Rocky Mountain Field Institute Citizen Science Training. After watching this video, volunteers will be able to define ecology and identify biotic and abiotic factors in a field setting. Ecology is the study of organisms interacting in their environment. The environment consists of two major components. We have the biotic factors that are living or once alive, and we have the abiotic factors, the non-living components of the ecosystem. In this video, we're going to focus on Garden of the Gods because that is the first place where our citizen scientists will be monitoring. Garden of the Gods is a city park in Colorado Springs, Colorado. It's a national natural landmark, and it is one of the busiest city parks. It is the busiest city park in the United States. Millions of people come to Garden of the Gods every year. If you keep that in mind, you will understand the value of the work we're doing in this program. There are three primary life zones in the garden. The first is the plains shortgrass prairie. This can be found in most of the low-lying areas in the park where soil development is more likely because the slope is less. So when you have flat ground, you have less erosion, you have more soil development, and more likely greater vegetation on the ground surface. This supports ungulates. Mule deer are grazers, and they are mostly living in the central valley of the garden. Most of the species we see in abundance, they're grasses. We also have many forb species, but they are not as abundant. So one of the species that's most abundant is this Colorado state grass, the blue grama grass. It's also known as the eyelash grass because when it dries in the winter, in the late summer, it curls up a little bit like a nice full eyelash. Then another grass that you can see a lot in the park is the little blue stem. Don't know why it's called blue because when you look at it from afar, it looks red. So the red bunch grasses are little blue stem. Another really characteristic grass is the green needle grass, which is really tall, taller than a human being. And you can see that by lot 10 and some other places in the park. Here, the wildlife, we have the deer, as mentioned before. There's also coyotes and jackrabbits, prairie dogs, hawks, eagles, falcons. Notice that we have lots of predators here at the top of the food chain. It's easy for birds to hunt in grasslands, easier to see the rodents and the rabbits on the land surface. And then we also have several bird species here living in the garden as well. Another life zone that's present in the garden is the Foothill scrub. So here the slopes are a little steeper. We have a bit more moisture supporting these woody species. Okay, so these deciduous shrubs are about 4 to 8 feet tall. The soils are gravelly, and it's much better for grasses to live in a smaller particle-sized soil. Two of the main woody species we see here are the mountain mahogany and the Gambel's oak. So the mountain mahogany, it often looks really chewed up because it is such an important browse species for the ungulates in the park. And these fuzzy curlicues are the seeds. I have another whole video that explains how this, how this seed development is very similar to a ski skin, the kind of skin you would use to ski in the back country uphill. But essentially these really tiny seeds are dart-like. They fall to the ground, they're heavy. When the fuzzy part is wet, it is straight. And when it dries, it starts to curl up, which drives the seed farther down into the soil. If this adaptation did not exist, then it is likely that most of the seeds would be eaten by herbivorous, granivorous rodents in the understory. The other species that we have here in the park are oaks, and this picture I took actually in Palmer Park, but similar ecosystem, of course. Oaks have a very broad diversity of leaf shapes. You might have noticed that before. Just an interesting fact. We have similar species here in the foothill scrubs as far as wildlife goes. Okay, now the vegetation is increasing in height even more. We have pinyon juniper woodlands in the garden. So see here, the arrow is pointing towards the central garden. So this picture I took on Rampart Road, which is on the western side of the park. And you can see extensive woodlands in this area of the park. Interestingly, the pinyon juniper woodland is one of the most widespread ecosystems on the planet at this elevation. So, excuse me, at this latitude. So we see similar patterns in vegetation with regard to changes in elevation and latitude. So the characteristic plants here are the pinyon pine and the single seed juniper. So here's a pinyon pine. And here's a pinyon pine needle, okay? I wanted to show you one cool thing. So pines are identified by the number of needles. Oops. The number of needles in the packet. So see how the pine's needles come out of this little packet here. And for the pinyon, we have 2 needles per packet. Then also you can measure a pine or identify a pine based on the length of the needles, okay? So let me get my arrow out of here and let's pick up this measure. So here we can hold this up to the pine needles and see that they're about 1 to 2 inches long for the pinyon pine. The length of the needle kind of depends on how moist the landscape is. Then we're going to turn the ruler, and interestingly, from the first knuckle to the tip of your thumb is about 1 inch. So if you're in the field trying to figure this out, you can use that first knuckle of your thumb to get a gauge on how long a needle is. So again, here we have the similar wildlife living in this life zone. And one thing you're going to notice as you learn more is that because animals can move around, they have broader landscape requirements. Whereas plants are sedentary, they stay put. So they need to have more specific landscape characteristics to develop and flourish on the landscape. So let's take a look at this historical perspective. So these life zones have always been here in the garden, but their relative abundance has really changed over time. So the picture on the left is one that is in the Garden of the Gods restoration plan, which I have cited later in the presentation. And then the picture on the right is just a modern picture. But notice how the picture in the left about, 80, 90 years ago, it's mostly grasslands and shrubs, shrublands. But now, over on the right, we see that there's way more forest, and that has to do with fire suppression. So it is thought that the Native Americans who lived here were burning the landscape in a prescribed burn to facilitate hunting and the development of their practices on the landscape. But we suppress fire, and we suppress fire to protect our modern homes. As a result, the woody vegetation has increased, and this obviously is going to cause changes for the species composition and the animals that live here. So there are some species that are rare and they are species of concern, and it might be related to this change in the landscape because of fire suppression. The rarity of these species and their imperilment could also be related to our recreational impact. So we're going to go on a little journey here and follow one of these species and just think about how landscape changes really influence the ecology, the interconnectedness between the living and the non-living components of the landscape. So microbiotic soil. It is possible that this covered all the bare ground in the park. This is a very delicate symbiosis of fungi, lichen, cyanobacteria, bryophytes, and algae living on the surface of the soil. This can prevent the effects of erosion, but once you step on microbiotic soil, it is destroyed. It is very delicate, so we really don't see very much of it at all in the park these days. Then we have the prairie goldenrod, which is right here up in the top right corner, another species of concern. The prebole meadow jumping mouse in the bottom right corner, and then honeypot ants. So we're actually going to talk about honeypot ants for the rest of the talk. So I did some research in preparation for this talk, and honeypot ants are very fascinating. This is an excerpt from a book that's over 100 years old, describing the ecology of the honeypot ants. And I put this in here because I want you to appreciate how important observation is to ecologists. But in this passage, we also get some cues as to what the landscape might be like where they live. Okay, so in the last sentence here, the honey is obtained in these cases not from aphids, but from the sweet juices exuded from certain galls found on plentiful small oaks in the neighborhood of the nest. So as we were just looking at, oaks are an important part of the vegetative characteristics of the garden. And here are the honeypot ants. Let's take another more modern look at this. Honeypot ants are true omnivores. They collect simple sugars from a variety of locations. So they can get nectar from flowering plants, from exudates from the galls, and from the secretions of aphids. You might have noticed that if you have aphids on your garden plants, they leave kind of like a sticky juice on the leaves. And so what's a gall, you might ask? Galls are parts of plants that are completely taken over by insect chemical signaling. You might have seen a gall. You might have seen a gall on a leaf. I added a picture of a leaf here. They can also be on the stems, but essentially it's a place where an insect lays its eggs and then the leaf grows over it and provides the young offspring with simple sugars to consume through its larval phase, and then once it matures, it just flies away. Okay, so we have the honeypot ants. And these honeypot ants cannot move. They stay in this picture up in the right corner. You can see they're kind of hanging from the wall. And that's where they stay. They do not leave this part of the colony. And then these other ants right here are workers, and they bring these simple sugars out from the field into the colony, and they deposit them into these repletes, the ants that have to stay in the colony. Because these repletes don't move at all, they need to live in a place where there is soil moisture, okay? So we've had very droughty conditions for quite a while, and it could be that drought or the absence of moisture, one of the abiotic factors in our landscape, is contributing to the scarcity of the honeypot ants. Okay, I did a lot of research to complete the food web, I couldn't find a lot of evidence for predation on the honeypot ants, except that coyotes and badgers have been observed tearing into honeypot ant colonies. So we have our ecological questions we're pondering, and we're thinking about ant ecology and all of those species that are rare in the garden. So we want to know galls from what parasites. Maybe the galls that they like to eat are no longer available. Then we want to know what kind of nectar do honeypot ants collect. Perhaps they collect the nectar of the white goldenrod, which is no longer abundant in the park. Okay, and then we want to think about our food web and one of our top predators being a coyote. What do coyotes eat? Do they eat the jumping mice? And then finally, what kinds of soils do the honeypot ants like to live in? Maybe they prefer these microbiotic soils. So when we're thinking about ecology and our role as ecological monitors in the Garden of the Gods and elsewhere, we want to think about all of these questions. We want to have our critical thinking caps on. Why are we seeing what we're seeing on the landscape, and what kinds of disturbances might have caused this system to get out of whack? And that is what the Room Feed volunteers are out there doing. They're trying to restore trails to bring the ecosystem back into balance, despite our recreational impacts, despite climate changes and or vegetation changes due to fire suppression. I used a lot of references in preparation for this talk. Here's a short list of them. If you want access to any of these files, please let me know. I'll help you to get them.